the wind moves across the Wei River valley, the way it has for thousands of years. But the skyline above it now belongs to glass towers and elevated highways, and only a rectangle of grey brick walls near the center of the city hints that something older is buried beneath the traffic. Stand on top of that wall at dusk, and you can see both centuries at once. Watchtowers and tiled roofs on one side, apartment blocks and neon on the other. And it is tempting to assume this wall has always stood here, watching over the same unbroken city. It has not. What is called Xi'an today is only the most recent resident of a landscape that has hosted capitals, rising and falling since long before anyone used that name. A landscape where Western Zhou kings once ruled from ceremonial halls, where the first emperor of a unified China built a capital and buried an army of clay soldiers to guard him in death, where Han and Tang dynasties raised imperial cities so vast they governed distant trade routes stretching into Central Asia, and where, more than once, those same capitals were besieged, occupied, and finally torn down until almost nothing remained. The city walking tour sees today did not survive from antiquity. It was born from the ashes of everything that came before it, which raises the real question at the heart of this story. How did the same stretch of land keep pulling empires back to build here? And how did it manage to matter again and again, even after losing the one thing that seemed to define it? The right to be called a capital. The answer does not begin with emperors. It begins with dirt, water, and the reason anyone chose to farm this valley in the first place. Roughly 6,000 years ago, communities near modern Bumpo were already settling permanently beside the region's rivers, building low pit houses, storage pits, and kilns close to fields that the Wei River basin kept fertile year after year. This was not yet a city, and it was not yet a source of political power, but it proved something essential: that the valley, known as Guanzhong, could sustain a stable population rather than merely serve as a corridor people passed through. That stability mattered more with each passing century, because Guanzhong combined workable farmland with mountain barriers and river approaches that made it unusually defensible, and a region that had once mattered only for survival began to matter for control. By the 11th century before the Common Era, that value drew the attention of the Zhou state, whose rulers needed a base capable of feeding a court, managing a growing aristocracy, and defending the political center of their realm. The result was Fenghao, twin settlements built near the Feng River that functioned as the ceremonial and administrative heart of Western Zhou power. And for the first time, the region entered history not merely as inhabited land, but as the seat of a government. Yet Zhou authority eventually buckled under internal rivalry and outside military pressure, and the royal court finally abandoned the region for a safer capital to the east. The valley lost its throne almost as quickly as it had gained one, and that reversal established a pattern the region would repeat for the next 2,000 years. That geography alone could open the door to power, but could never guarantee anyone stayed in the room. Zhou walked away, but the advantages that had drawn them here in the first place, the food, the defenses, the control of key routes, remained exactly where they had always been, waiting for a more determined power to exploit them. That power arrived from the west. Through the 4th century, before the Common Era, the state of Qin expanded its authority from bases in Guanzhong, using the valley's resources to build a centralized, militarized government capable of sustained warfare on a scale its rivals could not match. The Qin capital rose at Xianyang, just north of the Wei River, near the site of modern Xi'an, and it was from this base, not from any city later called Chang'an, that Qin Shi Huang completed the conquest of rival states and became, In 221 before the Common Era, the first emperor of a unified China. East of that capital, near Mount Xi'an, Qin mobilized labor and resources on an almost unimaginable scale to build a mausoleum complex meant to project imperial power even beyond death. And the clay soldiers buried to guard it stood as physical proof of just how thoroughly Guanzhong's resources could now be commanded by a single ruler. That achievement did not save the dynasty. Qin collapsed within years of unification, but the infrastructure and strategic advantages it left behind in the valley did not collapse with it. And when Liu Bang emerged victorious from the ensuing civil war, his advisors pointed him back toward the same region, arguing that Guanzhong's food supply and defensible terrain outmatched anything available further east. A new city rose near the old Qin palaces, and this one carried the name history would remember, Chang'an, the capital of the Han Dynasty. Under Han rule, Chang'an grew into a true imperial capital, its palaces and administrative quarters absorbing the weight of governing a sprawling empire. And each successive power in the valley was building not a continuation of the last city, but a fresh version of it, reorganized to fit new needs. It was also under Han that missions and campaigns pushed westward towards Central Asia in search of allies, horses, and trade, threading Chang'an into a shifting network of routes and intermediaries that later generations would call the Silk Roads. Routes that never ran as one straight line to distant lands, but passed goods and ideas hand to hand across many markets. Yet the same instability that had unseated Zhou eventually caught up with Han, and after crisis and civil war early in the 1st century, the Eastern Han court relocated its main capital to Luoyang, leaving Chang'an to face an unfamiliar question: what a capital city becomes once the emperor no longer lives inside it. For centuries afterward, Chang'an never fully vanished, but it never fully recovered its former standing either. As competing regimes rose and fell across a divided north, the old Han palaces slowly deteriorated even as armies repeatedly marched back through the valley, each new claimant to power recognizing that whoever controlled Guanzhong held a strong position in the wider contest for northern China. Amid that instability, the city found an unexpected role, becoming a center for the translation and spread of Buddhist teachings. As monks and texts arrived along the same westward connections that had once carried silk and diplomats, work associated with figures such as Kumarajiva that kept Chang'an intellectually significant even while its political fortunes remained uncertain. That long fragmentation ended when Yang Jian founded the Sui dynasty and reunified most of China, and a newly unified state needed a capital equal to its ambitions, one built for an administration far larger than anything the fractured old city could comfortably hold. Rather than patch together the aging Han capital, Sui planners chose open ground to the southeast and began laying out an entity new city called Daxing. Starting in 582, its streets surveyed as straight avenues rather than shaped by centuries of accident, its residential wards, palace district, and markets organized into a single deliberate system. When the Tang Dynasty replaced Sui in 618, it inherited both the unified empire and this freshly built capital, simply renaming Daxing as Chang'an. And in that renaming lies one of the sharper ironies of this history, that the city most remembered as an ancient Chinese capital was, in its most famous form, one of the most ambitious urban construction projects the region had ever seen. Sui had built the skeleton. What followed would give that skeleton a population, a fortune, and a reputation that reached far beyond the borders of the empire that built it. Under Tang rule, Chang'an matured into one of the largest and most disciplined capitals in the medieval world, its palaces, broad avenues, walled residential wards, and enormous eastern and western markets functioning as visible proof that imperial order could be expressed directly through the shape of a city. As Tang power and diplomacy extended across Asia, that order pulled in envoys, merchants, monks, and settled communities from far beyond China's borders, not blending into some casual melting pot, but living within a capital that remained tightly administered even as it grew remarkably international. Religious and intellectual traditions traveled the same routes as merchandise, and Buddhism flourished alongside smaller communities connected to Zoroastrian, Church of the East, and early Islamic traditions, each leaving some trace on a city built to absorb outside influence without losing its imperial center. Few figures captured that exchange as vividly as Xuanzang, the monk who returned from years of travel in India, with years of travel in India, with a vast collection of Buddhist scripture, and took up translation work in Chang'an itself, work that gave the city landmarks such as the big wild goose pagoda, as physical evidence that Chang'an did not merely receive knowledge from elsewhere. It processed and reshaped it. Along the busy avenues near the markets, a resident might hear several languages in a single afternoon and see goods carried from regions most of the city's population would never visit. A foreign merchant and a Tang official walking the same street while inhabiting almost entirely different social worlds. The wealth generated by all of this activity reshaped daily life among the elite as well, altering music, fashion, cuisine, and art until the golden age of Chang'an became something people could see and feel, rather than merely something recorded in court documents. But scale of this kind came with a cost that was not obvious at its height. Feeding, supplying, and administering a capital, this enormous depended entirely on a central government, strong enough to keep roads, granaries, and armies functioning as one coordinated system, and the very concentration of power that made Chang'an magnificent also made it extraordinarily vulnerable the moment that coordination began to fail. For generations, that failure seemed unthinkable, until in 755, it stopped being unthinkable at all. The rebellion, led by An Laoshan, erupted out of a military and political system that had granted enormous authority to regional commanders, while the imperial court remained divided against itself, and what began as one general's uprising rapidly escalated into a crisis that threatened the survival of the entire Tang state. In 756, rebel forces seized Chang'an itself, forcing the imperial court to flee the city it had built to project unshakable authority, and the psychological blow was as severe as the military one, because a capital that had always stood for the strength of the empire now stood as evidence that the empire could no longer protect its own heart. Tang forces eventually recaptured the city, but Chang'an never fully returned to what it had been before the rebellion. Its population and treasury diminished. Its regional military governors left with far more independent power than the court had ever intended to grant them. In 763, Tibetan forces briefly occupied Chang'an as well, a shocking reminder that what had once seemed impossible, a foreign army inside the imperial capital, could now happen more than once. Decades of instability followed, and by the end of the 9th century, the rebel leader Huang Chao and his forces seized the city again, inflicting further destruction on an urban system that was visibly losing the coherence that had once made it function. The end came in 904, when the warlord Zhou Wen forced the emperor to relocate the court to Luoyang and ordered much of Chang'an's remaining structures dismantled. Timber and building materials hauled away, residents displaced, whole neighborhoods reduced to open ground within what had recently been one of the largest cities on Earth. This was not simply another siege to be rebuilt from afterward. It marked the irreversible end of Chang'an as an imperial metropolis, and the Tang dynasty itself would not survive much longer. After the court it once commanded was stripped from the city built to house it. Yet a city does not need to be a capital in order to continue existing. Once the great wards of Chang'an fell silent, a smaller settlement began forming within the remains, its streets threading through what had once been the grid of an imperial capital, and across the 5 dynasties, Song and Yuan, periods that followed. The region continued functioning as a regional administrative and military center, even though national power had permanently shifted elsewhere. Losing political primacy did not mean losing usefulness, and that distinction would define nearly the next 1,000 years of the region's story. When Ming forces secured control of the area in 1369, the name Xian, meaning Western Peace, was applied to the new prefecture, marking a clear shift in identity from legendary imperial Chang'an to a fortified regional stronghold guarding China's northwest. Between 1374 and 1378, Ming builders constructed and reinforced the massive city wall that still defines the historic core of Xi'an today. A rectangle of rammed earth and brick, built to hold garrisons and grain, rather than an emperor's court. There is a quiet irony in how visitors often experience that wall now, assuming they are standing inside the legendary capital of the Tang, when in fact they are standing inside a much smaller Ming fortress built centuries after Chang'an had already been dismantled and largely abandoned. Trade and settled Muslim communities continued to shape the city's character during this period as well. Their mosques, market streets, and food traditions becoming a lasting part of Xi'an's urban identity, embodied in structures such as the Great Mosque, whose surviving buildings reflect centuries of construction and renovation rather than a single fixed founding moment. Under both Ming and Qing administration, Xi'an settled into a durable role as a regional administrative, military, and commercial center. Its survival no longer tied to the presence of an emperor at all, and inside its walls daily life revolved around markets, craft workshops, religious institutions, and courtyard homes rather than the machinery of empire. The city had learned to endure at a smaller scale, trading the grandeur that once defined Chang'an for a kind of durability that grandeur alone had never provided. For centuries, those Ming walls sheltered a city of relatively stable size, but the 20th century would break that stability apart. As Qing rule collapsed in the early 1900s, China entered decades of political fragmentation, and although Xi'an did not return to national capital status, its deep inland position kept it strategically significant to whichever forces contested power around it. That significance became unmistakable in December of 1936, when generals Zhang Shuiliang and Yang Hucheng detained Chiang Kai-shek in Xi'an, seeking to force a change in strategic priorities as pressure from Japan intensified. And civil conflict between nationalist and communist forces continued unresolved. The Xi'an Incident became a major turning point, and after negotiation Chiang was released, helping accelerate the formation of a second united front against Japanese aggression. A striking reversal for a city that had once watched emperors flee its gates and now found itself holding a modern leader captive to redirect the course of a nation. After 1949, the new state invested heavily in building industrial and scientific capacity, deep in the interior rather than concentrating it entirely along the coast, and factories, research institutes, and engineering programs expanded Xi'an well beyond the footprint of its Ming walls, giving the city an economy no longer dependent primarily on its past. From the mid-1950s, much of Jiaotong University relocated from Shanghai to Xi'an, eventually forming Xi'an Jiaotong University. And where the city had once drawn scholars, because it was an imperial capital, it now drew scientists and engineers, even without a court to serve. A continuity of purpose expressed through entirely different institutions. Then in 1974, workers digging a well near the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang struck fragments of buried clay soldiers, triggering one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the century. The Terracotta Army, once introduced in this story as a symbol of Qin imperial power, now took on an entirely different function, transforming from a hidden funerary guard into a global heritage icon. And in 1987, the mausoleum complex was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In recent decades, Xi'an has grown into a major metropolis, equipped with metro lines, highways, universities, and expanding technology industries. Urbanization and inland investment, restoring the city to a significant place within national and international networks, this time connected by railways, air routes, and logistics rather than caravans and imperial roads. With the ancient Silk Road's legacy itself later recognized through the Chang'an to Tianshan corridors UNESCO listing in 2014. None of this erased what came before it. Instead, the modern city grew up around the Ming walls and the buried remains of older capitals, so that a resident today might ride a subway beneath a skyline of high rises, climb onto a wall shaped in the 14th century within minutes, then travel east to stand before the Terracotta Army, or south toward the Big Wild Goose Pagoda, encountering history not as a single preserved monument, but as something scattered across the entire landscape of daily life. Return once more to that wall, at dusk, watchtowers on one side and glass towers on the other, and the view means something different now than it did at the very beginning. This is not the wall of Tang Chang'an, and it never was. It belongs to a later chapter, a Xi'an that rebuilt itself. After the imperial metropolis it succeeded had already been stripped down to open ground. Beyond it lie the deeper layers, the pagoda that recalls Tang scholarship, the buried lines of Han and Qin, capitals further out across the valley, the Ming streets and mosque courtyards that carried the city through centuries without an emperor, and the university campuses, highways, and rail lines that carried it into the present without needing one at all. Guangzhong's food, water, and defensible terrain explain why so many dynasties kept returning to build here. But geography alone never guaranteed that any of those cities would last, because each ruling power reshaped the land according to its own needs. Zhou into a heartland, Qin into the base of unification, Han into an imperial capital, Sui into a planned city, Tang into a cosmopolitan metropolis, Ming into a fortress, and modern China into an industrial, educational, and heritage center all at once. Xi'an never developed along a single straight line. Every version of it grew out of the failure, or the limits of the version before. And that, more than any single dynasty or monument, is the city's real inheritance. Chang'an once meant eternal peace, but its history tells a different story than permanence ever could. It is not stillness that carried this valley through 3,000 years of rising and falling capitals. It is the capacity to become something else, again and again, whenever the world demanded it.